Okay, so today we're going to be covering the fifth essay of the Jonas's Phenomenon of Life, which is titled Cybernetics and Purpose, a Critique. And he is quite harsh towards cybernetics. So cybernetics is basically presented as the science of feedback mechanisms, especially the negative feedback loop, which Jonas tells us first kind of arose from purely practical concerns in the Industrial Revolution, with the invention of this throttle valve and governor, which you can see on the picture. And then it's slowly moved over the years into a more theory-based approach, and got itself a brand new name, the name of cybernetics. So Jonas says that there's an unproblematic aspect of cybernetics. So just cybernetics as a new special science for the common principles and problems of control mechanisms and feedback loops, that's not what he's concerned with. What he is concerned with is cybernetics as a unified doctrine, a unified conceptual scheme for the representation of reality, and specifically for the representation of humans. And he over the essays, he alludes to these problematic analogies between human and artifacts that cyberneticians usually draw. So the classic mechanist, following like Descartes' animal automaton, posed like machine. There was this materialistic mechanistic aspect of explaining the body, but the mind was kept separate in another realm. Later we had like the materialistic, which treated mind as an epiphenomenon, which he then returns to in the appendix. And then cybernetics is for the first time a mechanistic model which applies to material and mental phenomena at once, not only equivalently, but identically. And this is a sort of overcoming of dualism. So there are some large claims that came from the cybernetics line of thought. And Jonas says that if behaviorism is an attempt to do psychology without the psyche, and mechanistic biology is a description of organic processes without life, then cybernetics is an attempt to account for purposive behavior without purpose. And the analogies where he talks about where you start treating machines as perceptive, responsive, adaptive, purposive, and all these propositions that usually account for human behavior or like organisms. Vice versa, you start talking about humans and human societies in terms of feedback mechanisms, communication systems, or as computing machines. And he says that there are 3 points of contention that he has with cybernetics, 3 topics: teleology, information, and mind. And he, in this essay, focuses on teleology. And just to kind of make, to get the thing going, what is his comment on cybernetics? He said that the solution claimed by cybernetics is spurious and mainly verbal. So what are these problematic analogies? So he starts first with this example of a servomechanical disturbance versus a neurological disturbance. So for the servomechanical disturbance, when a feedback is inadequately damped, it results in some kind of overcorrections, and the machine that was designed to hit a target overshoots and misses. And then you have a description of a cerebral patient with purpose tremor who is asked to carry a glass of water from a table to the mouth, and the hand executes a series of oscillatory motions of increased amplitude, and at the end he spills the water. So these examples are strikingly similar, but different. So different how? And Jonas says the patient wills to bring the glass to the mouth. He wants it there. So these are just like some three steps that he will go on to explain later in the essay more. But so willing, wanting. The end motivates the action from start and is intrinsic in all part motions. And this end provides a reference. So a reference where you can evaluate an action as successful or unsuccessful. Furthermore, the patient is distressed by the failure of spilling the water, whereas a machine does not care or is not neither distressed, neither excited about its missing the target. And lastly, he says that it is the patient's goal, it was his goal, a goal he has formed and entertained. So cybernetics, what is purposeful behavior for cyberneticians? Behavior is, for cyberneticians, any change of an entity with respect to its surroundings. And purposeful here denotes that the act of behavior may be interpreted as directed to the attainment of a goal. And this goal, again, citing cybernetics literature, is a final condition in which the behaving object reaches a definite correlation in time or in space with respect to another object or event. So Jonas then asks, what condition is final? What is the meaning of this final condition? And he has to, he concludes that the condition in which the action ends, that this is the condition in which the action ends, and this is the condition of rest. And if you go to the extreme, death is the most definite correlation to the environment. And therefore, this would mean that purposeful action would just be any kind of action that maximizes entropy. But this is then purpose or purposeful action becomes an empty notion. So how to demarcate purposeful from purposeless behavior? Cyberneticians, he especially quotes a specific text, but in this text, they give several examples of what they consider purposeless and what is purposeful behavior or mechanisms. So the roulette is for cyberneticians purposeless, but for Jonas, he immediately says, yeah, but the purpose, there you can see the purpose of the human designer in it. So the clock, again, for cyberneticians is supposedly purposeless because it has no final condition, because it just goes on and on and on. But again, Jonas says this just misses the point that you have to have a human that winds up the clock. So the clock itself is striving for this complete equilibrium, so this maximization of entropy, but and then there is this human entity that winds it and gives it its continuous motion. And then, okay, these are like kind of, okay, he doesn't really argue about these two examples, but then he goes on to the difference between a planet that circles around the sun versus a target-seeking torpedo. And let's say that this target-seeking torpedo is also kind of guided or influenced by the magnetic force. So the difference between these two is that in the planet situation, the changes in motion are the direct function of magnetic forces involved, whereas in the torpedo example, the influence of magnetic force is of the order of message, not of acceleration, and there is a receptor-effector connection that is not present in the planet. So cyberneticians would say that the torpedo has purposeful behavior. And Jonas kind of contends, okay, the receptor-effector connection is an instrumental condition for goal-directed action, but does it itself constitute purpose? So is there a missing link, and what is this missing link? The telos, the kind of the final cause of the target-seeking torpedo is obviously hitting the target, and behavior is purposeful and teleological because it's self-adaptive with regard to this result. And Jonas asks, what part of the mechanism of this target-seeking torpedo embodies this purposiveness? What part is not governed only by law of entropy, which we said that it's kind of an empty notion of purpose? So it's not the engine, it's not the sensors, it's not the transmission of its message, not the steering device. All of these parts act blindly out of their own mechanical necessity. None of them is concerned with the goal, but just with the attainment of its own purpose in terms of entropy. So the cyberneticians would reply, okay, but the overall purpose resides in the whole, in this receptor-effector coupling, and in the form of organization of the multiple system. And Jonas' reply is, yes, okay, but is the mechanism a whole? Does it have an identity or selfness that can be said to be the bearer of purpose, the subject of action, the maker of decisions? And this is, I kind of specifically marked this because it's not explicitly theorized, but I think Jonas is really trying to define this whole as having an identity. And then he says, okay, let's do a mental experiment. What if this torpedo is manned by a human pilot? So it's not self-driving in a way. And he says any kind of disconnections like torpedo pilot or car driver or a lumberjack like lifting his axe, there's not a single purposive entity. The bearer and agent of purpose in all of these cases is the human, whereas the machine is only the extension of the receptors and effectors of the human. You can envision this with the fact that the man can step out and walk away and take the purpose with him, complete and unabridged. So again, what is the difference between the human link versus the mechanical link? Why does a human perform this motion as and when he does? So the human pilot that is steering the torpedo. And cybernetics would say he does so in response to certain information from his receptors, or he acts as determined by the latter. He functions, therefore, as a feedback mechanism himself. And Jonas would reply, actually, the pilot operates because he wishes to keep the torpedo on target and in light of this purpose. So again, we're back to this talk of wish, of motivation, and this motivation, Jonas contends, can only be active on the basis of the concern of all life with itself. So if the model of purposive behavior for cyberneticians is just this coupling between receptor and effector, for Jonas, it is the receptor and effector coupling is kind of bounded by will or interest or concern. He says, it is the prior and coextensive purpose which qualifies the incoming data as messages if they are relevant to the purpose. It is I who let certain messages count as information and as such make them influence my action. The words like relevance are, I think, are here important to note. He also mentions this, which I found very interesting. So the social chain of purposes. He asks us to imagine that the pilot got his purpose is sort of obeying a higher up commander, and so this commander is kind of can be influenced by the purposes of some other higher ups, or if you follow it through, you would come to some sort of societal expectations. And he says that this teleological economy of a person is an ascending and expanding series of mediate purposes. And this dissociability of purpose and execution, possibility of delegating the latter extensively and distributably to others, or actually, I noted that this can kind of be connected to the theory of extended mind in cognitive science. So, but Jonas would say so that the torpedo is here a tool, and all other organismic entities here are the ones that have purpose, and sometimes they can become instrumental to other people's purposes, but they never, upon reflection, you still treat them like an agent with purposes. Then we go to the split personality theorizing part. So again, we have this situation where a commander enacts his purpose through a subordinate that steers the torpedo. So in a way, we can say that the commander mechanizes the subordinate, but upon reflection, he will grant his subordinate agency. So he may treat him sort of as an instrument or as a robot for fulfilling his goals, but when probed, he will grant still this subordinate agency. And Jonas says, okay, so the cybernetician is doing something similar. He has the same connection to his object of study, but he does not perform this reflection. And then he goes on to then maybe this is a bit more of a way that I phrased it, but he kind of tries to differentiate between talk of truth versus talk of causes. And this split personality theorizing is kind of connected with this, that this scientific materialistic image discards with its own validity if it talks only of causes and not of reasons, of purposes, of concerns. So the cyberneticians themselves will resort to talking of reasons and desires and wants when defending their thesis, not to himself as a feedback mechanism. So he doesn't apply the theory to himself, and even if he would, the concepts of validity and science itself would become kind of empty. And lastly, he kind of still wants to give a sort of a positive account of purpose. So where does this model of the sensor-effector feedback loops fall short? And Jonas says purpose stems from needs, and living things are creatures of needs. Need is based both on the necessity for the continuous self-renewal of the organism by the metabolic process and on the organism's elemental urge, thus precariously to continue itself. This basic self-concern of all life, in which necessity and will are bound together, so this feelings of appetite, of fear, of the pang of hunger, the passion of the chase, fury of the combat, the lure of love. These are not the data transmitted by the receptors, or these and not the data transmitted by the receptors imbue objects with the character of goals, negative or positive, and make behavior purposeful. So whereas cybernetics kind of stays on this level of sensor effector and just posits that motility and perception are needed for purposeful action, Jonas says that the vital ingredient missing is emotion, and that emotion is more basic than the two it binds together. And emotion in the pre-animal level operates in the ceaseless carrying on of the metabolism. And what machines lack is the instinct of self-preservation that is kind of enacted in this life's concern for life. Then the appendix is kind of a tour through materialism, determinism, and the mind. So this I'm going to keep really short and we can discuss it later, but he posits like a critique of epiphenomenalism and kind of goes into the direction that the scientific notion of causality is inseparably bound with spatiality. So it makes sense in the realm of res extensa, but there's a problem with transferring this causal scheme to the inner world, where time is the dimension of interest, not motion or space. And then there's some questions that popped up when I was reading it. So the chain of purposes and concern behind purposeful action. is this an implication for understanding all human purposes as social purposes? So, I mean, he talks about this sort of teleological economy serving kind of as a background for the purposeful actions of any human subject. And then is there this sort of chain of purposes, or maybe chain of concerns, this kind of background concerns in non-human higher animals? And lastly, I think he kind of doesn't really answer this question, and probably Timothy should be here to to debate this with me. But why does concern and emotion elude mathematical formalization? And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that very comprehensive presentation. Okay, so who would like to start with maybe with one of the questions that Ayla brought up?
Maybe Ayla can expand on some of the ideas, and we can take it from there.
I think that this is kind of a consequence of what he says. So, for instance, of the social, this kind of the social background from where this concerns stem, for at least in humans, right? But I don't know. This is kind of what I'm really interested in. So this sort of economy of concerns, like, and he even talks about so that a purely information processing description of society, of human society, is bad. It gets something really completely wrong because it fails to account, or it's not built upon a sort of a network of concerns, of desires. And so I don't know, maybe somebody knows better what are some maybe theories of trying to conceptualize this sort of network of desires that is not, I mean, one pops to mind is the psychoanalytic one, but is there another aspect of this that there is a known theory that theorizes, so the network of concerns of a community, for instance?
So your question is how you kind of interlink these domains of, say, the vital concerns, and then you get to the level where this forms a certain network within which this is somehow shifted and modified within a given community. So you're wondering how this is related, if I understand you correctly, or?
I'm interested in that. And I'm also interested in, I think he didn't, I mean, he kind of says that, okay, the emotions and motivations and concern are like the secret ingredient, the basic concern for life. And again, I agree, but this kind of relates to the last part, where this is not necessarily an explanation of, like, this is a fact, it's a description, but it doesn't like provide with any sort of explanation how does that emerge, or, like, I don't know, some sort of, like, I'm not sure what I'm missing. Maybe it's in the metabolic chapter, or the metabolic essay.
That's what I was thinking. That, I mean, as far as explanation or grounding concerns, I think that it's what we were talking about when he talks about the metabolism, and metabolism basically establishing this dynamism that for him is important to create like a space within which concerns acquire significance, so where you can meaningfully talk about concerns. Now, the question as to how, for example, what he talks about, the fundamental domain or dimension of need that is related to vitality, then gets to to the level of complex norms that you have and work on within the context of different social frameworks. I don't know to what degree he answers this. He does touch upon some of these things in later chapters, but I think that that's a slightly different question. I don't think that it's necessarily completely relevant for his point here. And it definitely isn't modeled on the example that he gives. So I think that the only reason why he gives the example of just having this chain of commands. So I think that one of the questions for you was whether this is how he actually envisions that dynamics within society works, which would be a very a very specific, very distinct society where we have like chains of orders.
But he doesn't, I mean, that's only the second example he gives. I think one is because in the other example, it's much more neutral. So he says just that even if the person is not obeying an order, but it's coming from himself, there's still like a background of like purposes and concerns that he is drawing upon that are and like guide his behavior in that particular time.
Yeah. So I think that when he talks about this, he would probably say something along the lines of that if you provided an analysis as to, for example, why are you currently taking this book home? Because I want to read it. Why I want to read it? Because I want to pass the exam. Why do you want to pass the exam? Because I want to get the diploma. What do you want to get the diploma? Because I know I want to have a good job. Why do you want to have a good job? Because, you know, and then you go back, and you get to these levels of how a certain dynamical framework of your identity was constituted against certain forces. And I think that what he would like to say is that there is a domain of vitality that provides maybe the outmost horizon within which you move, so that, you know, there's like this element of vital needs that constitute the very subtle horizon within which you then constitute other forms. But this is not to say, Ella, by the way, that this has to be necessarily hierarchical, I think, because you can also eventually adopt a mode of life which goes against this. So you can, for example, either commit suicide, or you can basically decide to live in a way where you will intentionally cultivate a mode of life which will try to put certain basic impulses and propulsions to something that is on the lowest level of the hierarchy of what you find important and of value. But what I'm trying to say is that, for example, if I try to trivialize, like there are such domains as you breathe, you sleep, you eat. These are all the patterns and rhythms within which you do things. So, you know, regardless of how much you, I don't know, whatever, and you can forget about it in the context of a given society. If you just have plenty to eat, you can always just go to the fridge and take it and you forget about it. Nobody bothers you when you go to sleep and whatnot. But we all know how important these dynamics are in shifting and molding many of basically the overall contour of the sphere of our existence. So I think that this is something that Jonas would claim, that there's like the dimension of vitality which you can kind of go back to, and that basically provides a certain interesting story as to why you as an organism would want to do something and why this would matter to you, why there's like a certain concern for you. Whereas with the machine, you will get to a certain point where you will always get to certain something that determines that from the outside, in a way. And just to add a little small thing, this doesn't necessarily have to say, I mean, doesn't necessarily mean that it has to end with one organism. It can also include the life as a whole, as you said. So, you know, when we're talking about life, are we talking about individual organisms or about life manifesting itself and actualizing itself in the variety and multiplicity of living beings, and this life as a process constituting these forces. So that's a different question, but that would be like an answer to that, I think.
Can I like make a little comment to that? Can you all hear me clearly, by the way? Yeah, so I think Ella, one part of your question was also of like examples of maybe like a social theory that works with these levels, these vital levels, as opposed to what Jonas critiques, which are this cybernetic account of the social, which is purely in terms of like feedback mechanisms. I feel like also connecting with Sebastian's answer, he's kind of broadly referencing to more existential theories of human behavior. Like I feel like Sebastian, you seem to mention something along the lines of Camus, and maybe more anthropological and more humanities-oriented accounts of social behavior. Like I think he's drawing a sort of categorical distinction between the cybernetic account in terms of feedback systems, which is ultimately, according to him, empty, and theories that are more humanities oriented, existential oriented, that directly address our concerns, our feelings, our existential feelings, and that these domain of theories get it much better or much clearer than compared to the cybernetic account. Like he doesn't spell out which theories he has in mind, but I feel like that's kind of the broad realm he's pointing at, that theorizing in that direction gets to the heart of the matter more clearly.
Yeah, one of the things, that I don't know, this is not maybe not going to be a good parallel, but for example, if you find yourself confronted with a question, one thing that you can do is, and it can be a tricky and a difficult question, and you can work on it and you master it and you show that you're very smart in that way. But there's also a different approach where you can ask, why would I want to spend my time answering this question? And given the fact that I know that the time is limited, which questions I really want to get answered? And I think that for Jonas, this information society is basically this ongoing back and forth of accumulating information, just posing questions, getting answers, not really knowing why. It's almost like I think that what's his name again? Postman, or what is it? When he talks about the development of new ways of spreading information, where you basically get bits and fragments that are not embedded into any meaningful whole for you, and you're just submerging that all day long. And you just kind of see, in Cincinnati, there's been like another clash between two opposite polarized fractions that are now present in the US. And then you look at something else, and then there was a disaster, and you're just bombarded with these things, or maybe an interesting fact about some rare mammal that's been discovered, and you're like, wow, this is fascinating. And you just kind of have this, you don't know why, what's going on. It's just like a whirlwind of things that you accumulate, and then okay, where did these mammals live? And you go and you check it out, and you don't even know why you're doing it. You don't have any meaningful framework or web where to put it in, and it just easily happens where you're just kind of whirling through this web of information, accumulating something, and even in a way that really doesn't have something to be anchored in. And for Jonas, I think that what he's trying to say is that you have to have a certain theory which would take a human being as the being capable of asking these meta questions as to, why do I want to spend my time on this? Do I want to spend my time on this? And what do I want to do with this? And do I even want to play this game? Not just accumulation, analysis, and spreading of information, but basically, what is it that counts as relevant information for me, or information at all, or whether this is just, more or less random noise. So I don't know what good theories this would kind of boil down to, but I'm guessing that there are quite a few. Many of them all of them probably stemming from the phenomenological, hermeneutical, and philosophical anthropological tradition would probably fall in this account, because they have this way of thinking about the human being, which kind of naturally lends itself into this type of understanding.
I mean, one question there, what would then be the relationship between that kind of more reflective type of purposiveness, where one can really step back and ask oneself, what are the questions that are worth asking, on the one hand, and the kind of more simple, vital purposiveness on the other? Because here, I don't think Jonas is terribly clear as to what he exactly has in mind. I think the notion of purpose that he uses here is essentially vital purpose. It's not essentially human. So then, what's the difference? What's the relationship between those two types of purposiveness? Because I read a couple of the following essays so far, and he does go into reflection, subject-object split, and stuff like that. But so far, I haven't yet seen an elaboration of that.
No, so if this is a question that can go in two directions. One is, if what's the Jonasian answer, and I honestly don't have an answer to that. But then there's a broader answer in relation to this particular tradition that we were mentioning, so which includes the authors that we usually mention or refer to. And here, basically, there would be a difference between, in a certain sense, normativity and metanormativity. So the capacity to not only kind of, let's say, if we use this particular term, enact a certain domain that is significant for you, which is kind of related to you being a living being, that is to say, having metabolism and this particular dynamics. But in addition to this, in addition to having this, having the capacity to kind of proliferate this domain, so to create let's say, a domain of possible domains. So it's basically the capacity to somehow enact or enlive a domain of the possible. I think that this is the crucial thing, like the introduction of the virtual or the possible. And it ties in nicely with also these other ideas, such as the one that you find in Plessner, where, for example, the idea is that the human being is by nature artificial being, so that it always needs some sort of an supplementation in what it does. And I think that, it is precisely because of this fundamental existential openness that it has this capacity of the possible and of the virtual, so to speak. So this would be the difference. Now, how it gets to this is an interesting question. What story do you develop about this? So how do you get to the position of this? And Plessner does it when he tries to kind of account for the eccentricity of the human being, and Merleau-Ponty does it when he's talking about the capacity to have the multiplicity of perspectivity. So, a living being, in a certain sense, kind of embodies a perspective on the world. What happens with the human being is that the human being is capable of embodying perspectives on the world. So the capacity to have different perspectives. And how this comes to be, now this is where something interesting for Ella enters the picture, namely the domain of the gesture and the symbol and the language. It is by the capacity to be a symbolic being that you can basically have the domain of the virtual, because that means that you can, in a certain sense, inhabit different domains without actually inhabiting them. So you, as Merleau-Ponty in the Phenomenology of Perception says, but then he kind of drops this term, you're able to project yourself into a certain something. Yeah. So you don't have to enact a meaning to be able to. So, for example, the animal will enact a hunger by doing something, behavior that is relevant for the hunger, but you as a human being can do a different behavior that designates hunger, but you don't have to enact it. I can produce voices with my mouth which have nothing to do whatsoever with the patterns related to eating or with the patterns related to mating, but I can refer to them. Yeah. So this is like the fascinating thing. You can have equivalent behavioral patterns, Adnan, between different, for example, what you acquire is the capacity to do this, and this is structurally equivalent to doing something like eating. The capacity to have this type of equivalence, yeah, you enact a certain something which starts designating a certain something. And once this happens, everything you do is in a certain sense surrounded by the possible realm of doing it differently. I know that this is not like a particularly exhaustive account, but it's like a hint as to how you can get this. This is also how you're always kind of eccentrically positioned, because you have the capacity to do this, where you can do different types of behaviors which refer to a certain something. You are never fully submerged into a certain situation. You know, you're always kind of slightly askew, because you can approach it differently. You can always position yourself slightly differently. And of course, when you're really, really hungry, this being askew is very minimal, if at all. But you can cultivate it. You can cultivate it to the degree where you can starve yourself to death. Now, this is fascinating. Isn't this fascinating? The capacity that you can starve yourself to death. I mean, it speaks volumes about what it means to be human, way more than this like sterile thinking about manipulating symbols or algorithmic whatever. So yeah, you know, I think that the key lies somewhere here.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and it's interesting that he precisely in the transition, which is a very short bit here and really beautiful couple of pages, he mentions precisely that. He says that suicide, this unique privilege of man, shows the ultimate manner in which man can become the object of himself. But yeah, at any rate, what seems crucial here is the subject-object split being sort of transferred to the realm of the subject himself, as he puts it here, or in other words, the capacity for reflection, the capacity of man to objectify himself as well, and not just to have, you know, a world out there, a way to sort of fold the epistemic relation back onto itself, essentially.
But the interesting thing is, when I said earlier, the way that you can objectify yourself is only if you're capable of adopting different positionalities, which means that you're able to virtually put yourself in the position of the object, that you can become an object from that particular perspective. So it's an interesting, you know, it's an interesting approach which really accounts for this self-reflectivity and the capacity of objectivity without necessarily kind of ending up in this absolutely theoretical split between subject or object, or either within like the fully enclosed subjectivity. So,
but for Jonas, this would something related to the human or life in general? Because I was remembering previous chapters when he talks about a certain freedom of form related to matter. And I was remembering this when Adnan asked this question about this freedom of form, because it's something that, in a certain sense, allows this the concern of a vital concern that is not related to the survival, in a certain sense. It's the condition.
Yeah, but with regards to the living beings, this freedom is basically merely the freedom of enacting the perspective. Then you have another freedom where you can vary perspectives. It's a different one. So, you know, the freedom of having a perspectivity is precisely the capacity to to use the Jonasian term, which Jan would have issues with, to maintain a certain form against the flux of matter, so to speak. So this maintenance, dynamic maintenance of form, this is the freedom he's referring to, but it's a minimal freedom. It's basically the seed that is then needed for the seed of freedom in vitality, which is needed for freedom proper in the domain of mentality. So in this way, so it's not like what I was talking about, that this you would find in living being itself. No, it's something that then eventually flourishes in the human being, but in a way where, again, from the Jonasian perspective, you will have a certain jump. It will be like a, it will be a certain shift. Again, the term that most people don't like, and I like to use, a qualitative shift. So it's a jump. And I'm willing to, this is the hill I'm willing to die on. There are not that many hills, but this is the one that I really feel kind of, it speaks to my whole being. So
I think I think it's very easy to read Jonas in that sense as well, because when he's talking about sight in, I believe, the next essay, he has something which in some way maybe in a less kind of how to put it, well, it reminds me in a way of Merleau-Ponty's analysis of sight, and most particularly in the visible and the invisible, but that's a whole other can of worms. But the issue here with Jonas, thing that's interesting is that that whole capacity for image making and symbolism and everything is prefigured in seeing as such. So even with perception, he, at least I would read him to make the claim that human seeing has to be qualitatively different from animal seeing in a way. It's not that we've got it's like the whole additive versus transformative theories of rationality thing, where the additive theories, which are, I don't know, they're often sort of taken to implicitly assumed to be true, which would take man to consist of some kind of a affectivity, which is the same as that of animals, and then plus we have some extra special thing on top of that, which is rationality. And on the other hand, the transformative theories, which take even the affectivity to be, well, transformed by the maybe it's not even best to say addition of rationality, because it's not an addition. A similar point in Heidegger as well. Man is not a rational animal because it's not, taking animality and adding something onto it. But yeah, I think given what he says about perception, something as basic as perception, while on the one hand, of course, even in animals, perception does require what he calls emotion, so some kind of a particular type of affectivity that can't be found in organic forms that aren't motile, that don't move, that don't have any kind of freedom of movement. But in humans, it goes essentially a step further. Apart from just the capacity to move around in space, it also involves, in a way, something that is the root of the capacity to make images and make symbols and make arbitrary references. And maybe that's, maybe Merleau-Ponty's notion of the world versus the environment is a really good way of framing that. That sort of, again, it's not an extra thing, but that sort of crucial characteristic of human seeing would be precisely that capability to vary perspectives, not explicitly, thetically, consciously, but just to have that kind of ingrained in our, to have the very threads that bind us to the perceived be malleable in a way.
That's a very good way of putting it. And I would just like to say that I don't know if this is the case with Jonas, but I think that this distinction that you mentioned between the additive conception of mentality, for instance, and the transformative conception is not really thought about deeply enough, because it has such profound and interesting consequences. And in Merleau-Ponty, you have this idea that there is not a single reflex that would not be, in a certain sense, minded or rational or human, but there is also not a single thought that would be not permeated by the vitality. So what you were trying to describe is precisely right. I think that, you know, the element of vital, why you need to really have a good grasp and understanding of the vital is, it is that which basically kind of anchors you or binds you into the, let's say, what for human beings is the world. Without this, if you start with the rational, you basically are going to sooner or later start kind of circling in the sterile void of ideas, so to speak. You need this, what Merleau-Ponty that constantly refers to by these colorful terms, such as, you know, viscosity and density and texture and flesh and meat, and like everything that's very meaty and fibrous, and, you know, what really kind of, so that he, on the level of language itself, shows that you're kind of really fundamentally, in a certain sense, interwoven with something. But there is a certain distinct and unique plasticity that is present. So it's really wrong to think that Merleau-Ponty tries to say, well, you know, we kind of have to discard these mental phantoms that are out there, they're kind of surrounding, and get to the pristine domain of our being anchored in the world. This is just wrong. This is wrong. This is completely wrong, because the world for the human is, in a certain sense, such that it is plastic wherever you grasp it. So what you need to do is not try to say, let's put aside language and focus on perception, is let's study perception so that we can understand language better. And once we study then language, we can understand perception better. So this is precisely, it's like a, you know, these are the domains of human existence that are deeply interwoven. And if you cannot simply say, I'm going to put aside language, as if language is something that distorts the pristine realm of the pure experience or something like that. This is just completely wrong. This is utterly un-Merleau-Pontian, and I would also say utterly un-Jonasian or Plasnerian. This is just not the way they try to do things, because it has this idea of layeredness of mentality, where you have one layer of life, and then the second layer, and the second layer, and the third, fourth layer, and so on. And this is just wrong. What they're trying to say is that you basically have to think about wholes that transform themselves after a certain time, so that the totality is changed. Once you get to the domain of rationality, you see differently. It's not just that you think and you see differently. Yeah, but you have to be able to perceive, to have perception, to even think. But once you think, you see differently at the very core of it, you know. And that I think is like something that is very often missing in discussions like this. And you put it precisely well. This is one very good way of thinking about it, about this distinction, like the milieu or the environment versus the world. And incidentally, this is something that I really, really think an activist, for the most part, gets wrong. They really don't have this distinction. They just kind of, you know, a bacterium has an Umwelt. Well, human beings have an Umwelt. It's slightly more complicated. I'm being too kind of critical here, because there is this idea of languaging, and they talk about languaging as constitutive of consciousness. It's never fully developed, however. So there's not a good theory behind it. They do not have a good account. And that's why you have, for example, life-mind continuity. What does that mean? If you say that life is a necessary condition for mind, that's one thing. But if you say that they're structurally identical, this I have issues with, because then you're just trying to be the king of the words, and you're just mixing things up. You know, I can say bacterium has experience, okay. And if, you know, I control the educational system, people will start talking like that. But I haven't really done anything properly by doing this, you know? So anyway.
So in that case, Ella, sorry, just to check one thing. So in that regard, it doesn't have anything to do with conscience or conscience about the motives, because when I was reading the chapter, I had this question about motives. If I'm conscious about the real motives that are behind my behavior, it's nothing to do with that, actually.
I think that the level of the possible, this capacity is basically what is crucial for being able to talk about consciousness properly. So you can have motives in the certain sense that you're driven by a vital need, but then you can also have a domain within which you reflect on the motive, that where you basically are able to become aware of the motive. So you're not aware of the structure that is opened up by a motive, and basically you enact a meaning by just following through this motive that is leading you, but you have the capacity to make the motive into a pattern that is relevant for you. So you have the capacity to use something else to make the motive, that which is usually precisely that which opens up the domain of meaning, the object of meaning. Now, this is the spectacular thing. And I think that this is, in my view, this is what it is. Kind of talk about consciousness properly, you have to have this capacity, not just the capacity to have meaning. That's why bacteria, in my view, there is no dispute. Like it is not conscious. It is not conscious because you're just toying around with words then. So the significance, proto-significance or what have you, is not enough for you to be able to say that you are conscious of it, because you don't, this meaning is not permeated or surrounded by the domain of possible shifts. Yeah. So, yeah.
I have two things, or maybe three, but okay. One is just a comment that even for like rationality, if you like kind of conceptualize it as a sort of norm governed behavior, it still presupposes that you are able to kind of how to say, act under a norm, that you are motivated to follow the norm. So in a way, even in this way, rationality or following rules of reasoning kind of presupposes a network or this capacity for motivation. So that's one point, which I'm really interested in. Like I have to think a bit about the others.
You can think out loud, even if it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't have to come out completely.
We can just interject to give Ella a few more seconds with a reading suggestion precisely on the additive versus transformative theories of rationality. There's one paper that I found really great on that topic. It's by Matthew Boyle, and it's called Additive Theories of Rationality, a Critique, from 2016. It's relatively short, and I think it does a great job of, I think it's from, the European Journal of Philosophy. Fairly short, but does a very good job of pointing to the key spots, the key conceptual nexus in that debate, if anyone's interested.
Also
maybe I
quite
just
dry. Yeah, just a very brief comment on this. Very technical and dry, so very analytically written. Just so that you bear in mind.
I should have mentioned that. Yeah, you can also read Being in Time, to get the same point across. It's literally, I think, in the first pages of Being in Time, when Heidegger talks about man not being a rational animal and so on. But yeah, for those of a more analytical persuasion, maybe Boyle's paper is more approachable.
Yeah, go on.
I just wanted to say, I mean, because there's this notion when I was reading Sellars and about some other authors, where Sellars also posits that like the coming of being of man was like a leap, a qualitative leap. But I think importantly, it's not like this comes from nowhere, but or even like, okay, with just the invention of like language from zero, but that you had like all of these linguistic interactions, or not even before linguistic, just interactions that kind of formed the background where this leap could have happened. So, it's not like from zero to we're conscious, but there's like this very complex system, and we can talk about this system of interactions that become, in a way, symbolic interactions before you have this conscious as. So before having this full consciousness of this meta virtuality, like there is a sort of a substratum of interactions where this sort of leap into self-reflection can happen, right? If that makes sense. I mean, for me, it was kind of interesting to read that.
I agree with that. And yeah, this is like a very interesting topic. And a lot of authors have tried to kind of develop this idea, why and how this leap happened, what the circumstances were, and what was it, or when it happened. So maybe since Adnan suggested a very dry, analytical, technical read, I'm going to suggest something very different. There's this one wacky book, and I'm mentioning it. It's not something that I would subscribe to or anything, but it's just so bizarre. It's wacky. And that's why it's interesting. So it's the type of book that you start reading it, and if it doesn't repel you, then you're going to read it in one day probably. It's by Julian Jaynes, and it has a very boring title. It's something like The Birth of Consciousness from the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, or something like that. Like very, very technical, very boring, and the book also looks very boring. It's like just white, dark letters, and that's it. Like nothing, no. But it's a very interesting book, and the thesis that the author makes is that what you see is the development of proper consciousness between the two books by Homer. So in the Iliad, what you still see is like this state of what he calls of a bicameral mind. And then in the Odyssey, you already have like a proper consciousness. And what is a bicameral mind? So he provides a phenomenological description and then provides a neurological account of it. The idea is that because the corpus callosum back then wasn't yet properly formed, what happened is that the two hemispheres were kind of treated as two separate entities. So what you had was living beings, human beings, that were living in the mode of a predominant left brain thing. And then the right hemisphere, check this out, was basically an intruder of sorts. So it was actually conceived of as an external entity. And I know when you put it like this, it sounds like so bizarre. It's just whatever. But when you read the darn thing and the examples that you give, so the way he reads Homer, for example, when he goes through the words which are used in one book and not in the other, and then he provides like very interesting anthropological accounts from the ancient Indian civilizations and stuff like that. And there's just like a whole plethora of things, ending up with schizophrenics, which could probably still be atavistic examples of bicameralism in contemporary society, and because they don't really fit into this society, they're much labeled as sick, you know, but basically they just still have the bicameral consciousness. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that he's trying to locate it temporarily, but then you have other people who are basically trying to erect like conditions that happened on the societal level usually, which used all this accumulated conditions and kind of brought this jump. I remember that Verweke, in one of his lectures, in one of his early lectures, provides like a very interesting analysis of, I think, 4 or 5 conditions that happened that could contribute to that. I can't remember. I think I can remember maybe 2, and even that very vaguely. So, but yeah, Ella, in general, I would agree. I mean, this is something that is close to what I'm thinking as well. It's not like just something that happened and came out of the blue, but it was something that, you know, things were there, and then it was like they reached the state that was just very, very saturated, and then you needed a certain something where the transfiguration happened. So this is also how I see it.
But it also kind of, I don't know, for me, it makes intuitive sense that this structure is still, the structure upon which this sleep could happen is still present in a way. And that in this way that I thought about this before, where Letitia was talking about, so this conscious or conscious purpose, or even like conscious anything, where the conscious part is kind of, I mean, you always have this background structure where you can move around, and perhaps it's connected with taking different perspectives, right? But I think it's interesting to try to conceptualize what this structure, what is sort of, it can be like a conceptual structure, but that's still very abstract, but like just somehow some kind of an economy, a theological economy, a symbolic economy, whatever, where you have like kind of positions you can take, kind of, you know, marked up, and of course you can change them. It's not like it's a fixed thing, but it's still, it enables you to move in the first place. So you, like, the movement presupposes the structure there.
And I thought about this question, Ella, because of your question of life understood in general, not only from the perspective of an individual. So I had this question about conscience, thinking about the life in general. So I thought about this, maybe this is still happening. So I don't know if it's a matter of degrees, maybe we are still evolving.
Well, there's one of the theses that is gaining so much traction and importance nowadays is this idea of reaching the state of singularity. So getting to the point of superintelligence would be one of the ways where this leap would happen. Because no, think about it. This would be just like in the domain of vitality. You basically, vitality enables a certain it is a background conditions which enables the institution of a novel structure. Now you would have what we call mentality as a condition of possibility in this network that we've created, where basically we've created virtual worlds where we are interconnected constantly, where you would be able to manifest or actualize a certain something. So when I'm thinking about this capacity of superintelligence, this is how I am kind of, how it could come to be. It would literally be taking another step. And then you can go into very like wild ways of phrasing it. It can be a very Hegelian thing. So you have mentality, the mind, in a certain sense, constituting itself and to a certain degree acquire a certain independence of the vital. But then you would get like a spirit that acquires the independence from the mind. You know, the mind is still kind of captured in a certain something, in a certain realm of what it can achieve. That there are certain bounds, and then you have another qualitative leap which opens up, and then the new horizons open up. Like very wild speculations, but it could be like that. But then check an even wilder speculation. Then you bring Whitehead to the picture, who talks about the God in all of this, and the God is not the God that is outside, but it's something that is God as evolving, God as a process. So this whole process, why the heck is it happening? Yeah. And yeah, I don't know. Then you can go in very interesting directions.
I think one issue with that kind of speculation is precisely that if it is another qualitative leap, in the same way that mind is in relation to animal experience, well then, it has to be by definition completely inconceivable, but really inconceivable in a radical way, because mind, having a world, all of that is characteristic of humans, would be, of course, completely inconceivable from the level below that, from the level of animal direct experience of the world. There's just no way that it could be. Sure, there are some structures in the former that are kind of transformed, transmuted in the latter, but nevertheless, it's in an interesting way completely inconceivable. So the same thing would have to, of course, apply to whatever kind of Whiteheadian God / singularity thing would follow.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's. I mean, I would say now it's inconceivable, but I wouldn't say that. I mean, I understand what you mean, but I think because of this realm of virtuality and of explaining the world in that this virtuality kind of gives you, human beings are in a bit better position to understand how things might evolve than animals. If that makes sense.
Understand that, but I think in that case, I would say that it would be, if we can conceive of it, then I would say that the analogy with the previous qualitative leap would be, in a sense, unjustified, because it's not, in that case, it's not as radical. It's more of a transformation. It's not as much of a kind of shift.
Yeah, no, but think of it in this terms. So here's a wacky thought. So you have these happenings, for example, the development of the internet, and then the social media, and we have these wars on social media and polarizations, and all of this is happening. And we are all kind of individually caught in that. We're trying to figure it out. We have these theories, kind of form camps, and okay, this is something that's closer to me. This is something that's closer to me. And what the heck is going on? But the thing is, all of this, what you see, like these patterns that you see, could, from that perspective, mean that they are basically precisely as on the level of the physiological processes to a minded being. So just like the cells are doing their things, forming certain patterns and what have you, and in a certain sense, of course, you wouldn't use this particular term, they're clueless as to what is going on, that thing could already be going on. That's the scary part, because you cannot envision it. You cannot have access. Let's call it spirit, just so it's easier to talk about it. You do not have the access to the spirit, to the world spirit. Yeah, it could already be happening. You see the things and you're kind of figuring things out. But this is precisely how it has to be, because you have to be doing these things for that other thing to manifest itself. But it's doing its own thing, and you don't know what the heck it is. So if it were to be instantiated, the only thing that you could probably do, you could say it could happen. But so it would basically be the middle ground between Ella and Adnan. You would be able to say, I see a pattern of development here. This could happen. But then you would have to admit, I have no idea what it would mean. Because if it truly were a qualitative shift, I would not be able to understand it, which basically mean it could already be happening and you absolutely do not know and you cannot know. Because you could be involved in it just like the cells are in the functioning of whatever part of your organ or whatnot. And there are, you know, things that are falling apart, there are tensions, polarities. Something is developing, something is getting birth, you have no idea of it. So I know, I mean, intentionally speculative, but just kind of bringing this point in. If you truly articulate it to the end, and if you cannot grasp it, it's basically, in a certain sense, happening.
But here's another wacky twist to that. So if we take some kind of a trans individual kind of, spirit into account, and if we also accept that it's impossible for us to understand it completely, that we are as oblivious to it as our individual cells to the existence of our bodies, why would that thing have to wait for the internet?
Maybe it didn't.
No.
Maybe that's just one of the parts, just like you're developing and you from a initial bundle of cells, you're kind of growing. Internet is maybe just one way of it acquiring its proper form or what have you. I don't know, because things are becoming so, I don't know. I don't have access to it, Adnan.
This is getting really Hegelian here.
Yeah. That's why I insisted that we should call it spirit, so that we first off scare away a lot of people who might be, listening, except for the proper Hegelians. They'll. Ella, yes.
It's not connected to this, although it's interesting. But before, where you were talking about whether bacteria or like just these simple organisms are conscious, and this demarcation point. And I don't know if this is an established distinction, but from what I read, like Stellars and other authors, there's a distinction between conscious of something and conscious as something. So the difference between being conscious of an apple and being conscious of an apple as an apple. Okay. And I don't know, maybe this is a really crude distinction, but this conscious of an apple as an apple would be the sort of the symbolic, the application of a concept.
My response to this would be that this is a terminological solution. You simply want to extend the notion of conscious, so you basically extend it to what I say, this is not consciousness yet. And you'll say, it is consciousness, but it's consciousness of, and then later you have consciousness of as. And I would say, okay, cool, but still there is a qualitative leap between one and the other. So regardless of how you want to...
It is. I'm not saying that there is not. I think also that humans possess both of these. So, or like there might be like inseparable in a way. But before you were talking about that bacteria is not conscious because it doesn't possess this virtuality. But I'm guessing you would say that some higher forms of animals are conscious of their environment, but still do not possess the same sort of virtuality that humans possess, right? I mean,
yeah. I mean, I don't know how I would talk about this. For example, in the structure of behavior, Merleau-Ponty, not very systematically, admittedly, he at some points uses the term or distinction between existence versus consciousness and sometimes experience versus consciousness. So it's weird. He is not very clear on this. But it could be an interesting, maybe, terminological distinction. Like, I don't really know. I have to admit that the more I kind of have these debates, the more I dislike the notion of consciousness, because I have the impression that it developed in a very specific time period, in a very when you had this very pronounced chasm, which is not necessarily bad, which developed in modern philosophy, but there it made sense because you had consciousness as the realm of the ego, and you could understand what it means. But once you want to get out of this, then it becomes just very murky. And it's almost like you're trying to use a certain term in a completely new framework, and it doesn't really fit that well. So I don't really know. But I would say if you want to talk about consciousness in this very strong sense of the term, which is like a proper sense of the term, it has to have something to do with this virtuality. And this is related to the capacity to have gestures proper, which is symbolic behavior. So this is my contention. So with regards, and of course, then you always get to the friggin' monkeys. So what do you do with that, with the great apes? I don't know what to do with the great apes, to be completely honest. I find there is some resonance in me with this Merleau-Ponty analysis where he's kind of trying to show via Köhler, and this is not empirically very robust because he did these experiments way ago and they're not like, you know, the standard that you use today. But he's trying to use some examples where he's trying to show where you find this distinction between having a proper symbolic behavior and not yet a proper symbolic behavior. And the one that I found the most interesting is where you have a chimpanzee in front of a slot where a banana is inserted, and then it has to perform different ways to get this particular banana. Yeah? So it can either grab it, or then it's out of its reach, but you give it a stick so it can pull it to itself. Yeah. And then the tricky one is the one that it cannot do is that instead of allowing it to use the stick to pull it towards itself, it could pull it away, push it away from itself, and then around. So, you know, imagine that there's a box like this. You can put the stick in, but you cannot grab the banana. So you have to literally push the banana away, which is a counterintuitive thing to do because you want it to come to you, not away from you. So it would have to push it away and then go around it. But the thing is that what Merleau-Ponty is trying to say is that for the monkey, this move is not the same, even though with the body, if it had the capacity to go to the banana, it would be able to do the same move, which it cannot do with the hand. But for us, it's the same. So going from A to B and B to A is the same. But with the monkey, the body, the lived body, has still the preeminence. So it doesn't have so it's like still the fundamental anchoring point in the coordinate system. Whereas with the human, you have this capacity to shift the perspectives. And because you can do this, you can position yourself into the position of banana and know what to do from this perspective. You don't do this in this particular way because your perception is already structured in this particular way. Yeah. But this is the capacity that you have. So what I'm trying to say is that even with monkeys, I would say that I would go in this line. I don't have like the full-blown proof of that. There is a Tomasello guy who is, I don't know what he evolutionary something, and he's produced a couple of books which are very interesting, where he's making these distinctions very, very clear from a scientific perspective. Look, if I were to write a paper, I would of course use him. But for me personally, what I'm doing, this doesn't really make it or break it. For me, on the level of the phenomenon, yeah, I would say that there is this structural difference. Now, the reviewers might not be necessarily completely content if I said this, you know, what's the source? I find it structurally appealing in the footnote. It kind of coincides with my aesthetic taste. But all this to say is that I would still claim that there is a distinction. But I don't know, you know, then you can say, but is it conscious? In a very strict sense, no. And then, of course, people get angry. So, you know, this is like a very Cartesian.
I think it's very dependent of what you mean by conscious. But
Yeah.
even like saying aware, I don't know if that's a better term for you, but I would say that animals, of course, are aware. I would say that they are conscious also, but not in the same way that human beings are conscious. So maybe awareness is here better awareness, I think this basic awareness is probably connected with having relevance and motivations and concern in the first place. So I think there is something.
The problem
Yeah.
is that there was like a very specific erosion of the concept of consciousness, which happened, through the development of biology and whatnot. And basically now it kind of is used as a synonym almost for almost sentience. And if this is the case, I don't really find it as a particularly useful concept anymore. So I will use something else instead. So if you ask me, is that consciousness? I don't know what you're talking about. I really, at this point, don't know what you're talking about, because in a certain sense, it became like a battleground. You had the cart and the old idea that there is like a certain domain that is characteristically human, and then everybody was fighting that for 2 centuries. And what happened was that eventually you had this like conceptual inflation almost of the term, which ended up meaning a whole plethora of things. So it's not particularly useful to me, because very often it's used more as a moral term than a term that would mean something. You say apes are conscious. In a certain sense, you're telling me, the ideas where you had this distinction that humans are different because they're conscious, it's wrong. It's not about, you cannot really articulate what consciousness is. It's almost like it become like a battle cry. Yeah, conscious, and everything is conscious. Bacteria are conscious. So maybe so. I don't know, because I don't know at this point what the term means. For me personally, it's become more or less useless. And this is also, Atul will probably know this, in one footnote in Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty says that something about along the similar line. Consciousness is like a very strange term, so we're not going to use it. But then he keeps on using it. I will try to find that footnote. But he was on the right track with this comment, I think. It's just like, I honestly don't know what to do with it sometimes. Okay, before we continue, I would just like to put this out there in the sense of, would any of the 2 members who are normally just silent like to maybe ask something or comment something or pose a question, so that it doesn't seem as if we're being negligent or ignorant? So if there's like something that you'd like us to discuss.
I can just give a signal of viability and just maybe agree with the whole issue with using consciousness, but just using any other word instead of it without being able to talk about what you actually are trying to define, then it would just lead to the same problem. So just using a different word is not really in any way a solution of this whole chaos with the word consciousness.
Yeah, I agree. What you have to do is you kind of have to flesh out an account that would be more than just using a word. So, and I think that you can talk about the mode of existence of being a human, and that already. So if somebody were to ask me what's consciousness, probably one of the shortest answers that I would give is, I would say that this is a distinct way of being human. And I would say that in this regard, it is synonymous to mentality.
But you would still have to talk about how it emerged, and then you would use another word for it, right? If you compare it with higher apes, for example, you would still need a word that would account for how their mental aspects work and how yours work. So it would still be the same issue in the end.
Precisely. That's why I said, if somebody were to ask me this, but because the consciousness is so Latin, I would try to avoid it, and I would try to describe it in terms that, for example, we were using when Adnan was talking about the distinction of having an environment and being in the world, stuff like that, or eccentric positionality. These are useful things. I would say that you have to have this eccentricity to be able to talk about consciousness again. Yeah, but I would also omitted because
this is
of things.
Also the whole argument of Varela when he's deciding on whether he needs to use the word information or use it with a hyphen, information. So I think he solves it really in a genius way there. So we can find something that would still have a similar connotation or even notation as consciousness, but just, you know, twist it a bit.
So we separate con and shens. We had a hyphen. Only maybe start talking, maybe we can rehabilitate or revitalize the term conscience, not consciousness, but conscience. This wouldn't work, of course it wouldn't, because it's even more Latin.
It kind of seems to me like it's trying to reinvent the wheel, and we're just going to come up with a new kind of language and pretend that it describes things in a completely different way, but we're still going to be gravitating around this central idea that has been with us since millennia, even though it might have gotten different linguistic expressions. So I'm not sure the right way is to try to avoid consciousness, to really try to get what is wrong with it. For example, why do you think consciousness as a term is so human? Why would it have to be limited to a human? I didn't get that.
Because for me, consciousness is this precisely the capacity to have a structured world which is like properly layered, and it has horizons in it. So something is given, again, it's a certain something, and you can only have this with virtuality.
But why is it that? Why do you need this structure and these horizons? Why can't it be wider?
Because this is how it kind of was used, that it was something that was related to the mindedness. We started off by using it in a very specific way. But then, because people didn't want to have human beings being exceptional, they started spreading it. So, you know, when Descartes talks about consciousness and when Kant talk about consciousness, they are using it in something that is more related to this, and phenomenologists as well. But when you have a certain biologist talk about it, it can be just like the capacity to respond with a negative affect. I mean, that's okay, cool, but are we really talking about the same thing? And then what ends up happening is like, consciousness is a complex word. Here are some of the meanings that it can have. And at the beginning, then you have a plethora of meanings that you have no idea how they fit together. It just seems like completely random because you have different classifications. And this is the problem with it. I wouldn't, for example, if I were to write a book, yeah, I wouldn't not use it completely. I would use it, but very contextually. So I would kind of try to develop slowly what I mean by all of that. I dislike using it in discussions. So I really don't like getting into the question of consciousness when there's a discussion, because it's so normatively laden that it just very quickly becomes very counterproductive. So, for instance, if when I'm teaching the chapter from the Tree of Knowledge, the one that you had about languaging, yeah, and I'm trying to convey this idea that according to the authors, languaging is something that is related to self-consciousness proper. 70% of people have a visceral reaction to that, because they are vegetarians, they are vegans, they are this and that. And I'm not bashing this. I'm just trying to say that all this gets thrown into this term, and they don't hear what you're trying to convey. So, okay, forget about the term consciousness. Yeah, just listen what they're trying to do here. Listen why they're trying to say that languaging adds something specific. You know, because as soon as you get into the consciousness thing, then there's just this whole question of animal rights, and we're fighting against like old phantoms and all of that. And most people even don't know that they're fighting phantoms. So it's like a triple whammy. Yeah, they're phantoms in the closet. And all this for one word. So that's the thing. Oh, there you are. Okay. You got shifted. Because Ella disappeared, and then all of a sudden you were moved, and I couldn't see you anymore. So yeah, go on.
One thing about the whole issue of consciousness here, I think more so than the issue of the exceptionality of man or lack thereof, I think the factor that has contributed more to this shift in meaning of consciousness was the whole qualia fascination in philosophy of mind that was, pretty much the whole bloody field of philosophy of mind for quite some time. I think that's maybe even, I've always seen it as the main reason. I have never really looked into the matter too deeply, but it always seemed obvious to me, like that's the reason. The fact that philosophers of mind were talking about nothing other than qualia, and qualia are, of course, incredibly simple kind of things. Just sort of bare, we can call them sentience. You use the word sentience, so that would be a good description here. And of course, it seems incredibly intuitive to ascribe some form of qualia to animals. I think, given how simple qualia are taken to be, that I don't see too much of an issue with that. But yeah, I think because the debate was basically moving constantly on the conceptual field of qualia, that's just all that consciousness was meant to be, or rather was taken to be.
See, Alan, I would disagree with this. Let me explain why. I think that qualia is the capacity of the analytic mind. It's not something that's fundamental. It's something that is very, very distinct to a very specific way of positioning yourself towards the world. There are no qualias for a chicken. An interesting example was given, for example, by Köhler, who did a very simple experiment with chickens. You know it probably, Adnan, right?
Yeah, of course, the relationality thing.
But let me just explain it, because some people don't. So he trained chickens to differentiate between two different colors, a darker color and a lighter color. So, for example, let's call the lighter color 2, and then the darker color 3. Yeah. He trained them to pick the lighter color, that is to say 2, right? And then he added, in the second experiment, he added an even lighter color, which was 1. We call it 1. Yeah? It was even lighter than 2. And then the question was, which of the two the chicken will pick? And it didn't pick 2, but it picked 1, because it didn't train to recognize qualias, but the relationships. So I would say that the relationships, the rudimentary significatory patterns and structures, have precedence over qualia. So this is a huge issue in the analytical philosophy of mind for me, because they start with qualias because they have a very specific preconception of how things are structured. You start with very simple things, like you do in the world with the atoms. So you need something. What is it? Qualia. There are no qualias that are fundamental structures of the experiential world. So I would agree, however, that their introduction of the notion of consciousness and relating it to qualia made the whole thing even more problematic, because then it was just about these fields, qualitative fields. It wasn't about the structures and the patterns and the dynamics and whatnot and the meanings. Yeah, it was about the redness of the red, the blueness of the blue, the oomph of the symphony, stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I don't like the concept of qualia either. I don't, and I think, of course, as a rule, humans don't have qualia either, for the most part, in that sense. But the point was that, for better or for worse, for a long time, that was qualia were taken to be completely simple. And that was basically taken for granted. That was, in philosophy of mind, that was never really questioned for a very long time. And I think that's what led to the notion of consciousness being transformed in such a way. But then, of course, the issue is whatever kind of sentience we can ascribe to animals, particularly not exactly high apes, but some kind of, not lower animals, but average animals, let's say, like cats and dogs or whatever. It has to be something simple in some way, but not necessarily, definitely not simple in the way in which qualia would be simple by being sort of Lego blocks that make up, experience. It has to be simple in some way, and in that way, I don't know. It has to be, in a way, qualitative, but not qualitative. If you take qualitative to mean what most people, most philosophers of mind do take it to mean without ever really explaining it, then no, it's not qualitative. But if you take it in a different way, then of course it's qualitative. It has to be qualitative. It's hardly quantitative.
Yes, it's true. The thing is that the speech of qualitative here has again, we are treading into the ground where there are a lot of equivocations. So qualitative sounds similar, very different. Qualitative here would just mean, it would have a very different meaning, which would pertain to the perspectivity of a living being and how things in a certain sense is given to it. And this would mean something more akin to a certain pattern that is significant for it. Yeah, and here the Goldstein's idea is very, very pertinent, where you have this, that the living being will show what is simple for it. So it is not something that is objectively simple, that is the simple, but it is what is simple for the organism, that is what will be simple. So it is not the objective criterion that kind of determines it. But here's like a whole plethora of problems where you talk about these things, and then the issue that happens is that you will have these contemporary attempts of a more synoptic kind of view, where you have analytic philosophers of mind and phenomenologists coming together, and they talk about consciousness, and it can become a bit of a mess, I think, because you come from from such different traditions that there's a huge gap, even discrepancy between some of the words that are used. So it can be quite a problem, when you talk about this. I don't even know how we got here. So, but yeah, Primož, you brought this up. Maybe you were kind of taking this into a specific direction.
Not really. I don't really remember what direction I was taking it in. Yeah, I guess the question that remains for me is, say we have an animal and the animal wants to reach a certain goal to meet its basic care for life, if we return to a Jonasian language. And it has this, I don't know, motivation, desire for it. What is it of this desire if it is not conscious of this desire or not aware of this desire? What is the mode of this feature of its existence that it suddenly has a motivation? So this is, I think, okay, we might say consciousness is too laden with presuppositions, but then what do we call this?
Well, intentionality would be one term. That's quite useful in this.
Is that really a cleaner term? Don't we have whole traditions also and disagreements around that?
Yeah, for sure there is, but like it has this very fundamental meaning also, where you have this just fundamental polarity, or let's say fundamental directionality towards a certain something. If nothing else, what you get is this idea of something being polar, a certain tension being created. And this is enough, what you need in a certain sense. And of course, yes, again, the only reason why I think that intentionality could be more useful is because it hasn't really become such a profound battleground as consciousness. Because for the most part, when you say intentionality, most people will be like, I don't know what this word is, so okay, explain it to me. Then you will have a Husserlian in the class, and he'll say, yeah, but actually, You know, this is not what intentionality is. And then you can have, of course, one of these debates. But barring that Husserlian, who nobody will understand in the class, you have greater space. You can also use Congolemian polarity maybe, but then somebody will say, yeah, but we have polarity in chemistry. So
my problem with these terms is that they're so formal. I feel like they don't really capture this more qualitative experiential level of having motivations.
Heidegger
Like
tried
you're
to do this.
intentional. I'm being in the, I
But
have the intention.
Heidegger tried to do this. He was literally intentionally trying to create a whole new language just to avoid these pitfalls. And what happened was that this language itself then became a matter of fetishization and a new box of problems. So there you have thrownness, Primož. You have concern. You know, it's like being for death.
But aren't you actually saying now that maybe being too scared of consciousness is a bad idea because we might go in Heideggerian dead ends?
It depends on the context, I would say. Like I said, if I were to write a book, I would probably use it in a very qualified manner. But when we have discussions, I'm very careful, because if you don't have enough room, yeah, here we can have this type of discussion, we can flesh it out. But in certain contexts, you just throw out consciousness and it just evokes so many visceral responses that it's just completely useless. People just all of a sudden start living in completely different worlds. You just say consciousness and you have the plurality of worlds in front of you. It's just everybody's just like, bleh. You know, if you prior to that you had an approximately unified field of forces, so you have another formal way of describing it, and then all of a sudden you have a huge mess where all the vectors are pointing in their own separate directions.
Because this, if I may mention for the first time in my own words, Blessner, he does he skips trying to deal with this term like in great detail. He just says, yeah, the moment we have a selfhood, a certain entity which becomes a selfhood, has a possession of its features and whatever, there's a consciousness, and this is all consciousness is, and he doesn't really go into detail on the higher levels with this specific term, and he just operates with positionality and eccentric positionality and so forth. So I guess he had a similar problem. He doesn't really cover. He doesn't get into the trenches on this specific term.
For him, it was even more difficult because he had the whole heritage of the German idealism, which literally circled around consciousness. And there, consciousness is a very different beast. So, you know, there were even better reasons why he wanted to just, you know, mic drop, you know, this is consciousness, and then I'm getting away from it.
Sounds like you would need a subject taught at universities that would go through all of the different meanings of consciousness.
That's why I have a course that is called Philosophy of Life and Consciousness. We haven't still gotten to the going through all the stories about, but it would be wouldn't it be interesting if one managed to have a course of the genealogy of consciousness? Wow.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's a good project to strive for at a certain point.
Yeah.
Sounds very French and something you have at the Sorbonne.
By the time I prepare the material, I'll start using what do they, you know, those cravats, the special French ones, the ones that are like inside, you know, around. Barrettes are no longer in fashion, so I'm not going to use.
You also need to shave bald.
True that. Maybe by then this will be an organic process. Won't even necessarily have to do much about it, just like kind of let it be. But anyway, any final reflections or thoughts? Maybe we can still, especially if someone had like any thoughts while reading, so that this doesn't stay unarticulated, and you think that it won't take an hour to develop it, then please.
Well, one sort of maybe short question that I had is, to what extent does Jonas's critique in this essay apply also to second order cybernetics? Is it mainly focused on first order, or does it also apply? It felt to me like it's mainly oriented towards first order cybernetics, and second order kind of takes into account the circularity more and the selfhood and all these issues that he was taking issue with.
I think that you're absolutely correct there, Atul. It's precisely this recognition that you cannot put yourself out of the picture that you're trying to develop if you want to make it comprehensive. And the question is whether the second order cyberneticians were able to do a good job in this. That's an open question, in my opinion. I think that they recognized the problem, but then they ran out of money and couldn't basically continue with the project. That's the truth. The reason why I'm saying they ran out of money is because from first there was the main guy who was kind of running the show, and his institute ran out of funding. So that was basically the infamous death of second order cybernetics. I mean, it still continued, but like, you know, if you do stuff in this format like we're doing now, you're probably not going to make this into a groundbreaking something necessarily. You need more concrete things to achieve that as well.
I had another idea, or I liked the way he talked about how science has this aversion towards anthropomorphization, but it is in ascribing purposes to machines and stuff. It is actually being really anthropomorphic, but in the background there is really this desire not necessarily to anthropomorphize machines, but to mechanize humans. And I wonder, what is the situation today? Like, we have this ChatGPT emerging and all this artificial intelligence. What are we trying to prove to ourselves? That we have humanized machines, or that we have mechanized ourselves?
Ela, this is a perfect question for you.
I didn't catch the first part of the question, but I mean, so what is it? Are we trying to prove that we are machines, or that ChatGPT is what's the question? What's the core of the question?
Are we trying to prove that we have vitalized machines, made them more human, or are we trying to prove that we have mechanized ourselves, that we are nothing but algorithms and machines? Yeah.
I think neither, really. I mean, I think saying that it's one or the other is kind of wrong. And I mean, you have these sensationalist titles of, oh, it's sentient, or just like being really grim and, oh yeah, human processing is just like statistic prediction making. And probably, it's kind of it's both are a bit true and also a bit like, okay. I mean, sure, you can have like a model of language that is that captures some of the properties of language, which is basically statistical and based on distributional semantics, but it doesn't capture all of the aspects of language. And I think what is also really important is that ChatGPT is not doesn't have this sort of motivational or teleological network, right? Teleological economy. It doesn't have motives for doing things.
But this may be the case, but why do we want it to have these motives? That's what I'm curious about. It's like we have especially some people are really passionate about trying to prove, no, this is it, it's game over. We basically are right on the threshold of making living machines or making mechanized humans.
I think it's like maybe there's a satisfaction in engineering things that maybe if you studied natural sciences, like it feels very satisfactory where you do something to reality and reality somehow responds. And I think it's a similar like wish to kind of manipulate something and then derive explanations from this, right? I mean,
But
you
Ela,
you
there's a meta question to this immediately. So what is it that gives satisfaction in this way of interacting with the world? Because this is where I think it becomes
I think it's like a way of understanding things. I mean,
yeah.
like, I mean, even I'm not sure if it's present for you, but I would say that it's present for a lot of people that like, something you poke things and you see how they react, or like even not even in a natural setting, but even like in a conversation, right? You in a way you poke with your questions and you receive some kind of response. So it's just sort of like building this understanding of how your like niche interacts with you, right? So that I think that there's like a basic,
But Ella,
yeah.
check it out. That like why for instance that like this would be a whole life project and it would require a lot of poking and doing stuff. Say you go to the beach and you number all the grains of sand there. That's a massive project, but nobody's going to do it. So what is it? Why do we find it fascinating creating this type of stuff? So again, why is certain type of poking interesting, the other not so much? Because I could poke this room in many different ways, and I can assure you I won't be doing it.
I guess it becomes redundant.
Who knows? No.
It becomes redundant in a certain aspect, right? I mean, I don't know. I think my brother said that his professor of biology in high school said, okay, this is not like severely connected, but that he said that why is biology more interesting than physics? Because if you we have a rock and you just like let it go and it just like falls to the ground each time, mostly, if you're on Earth and la la la. But if you have a bird in your hand and you open it, you don't know what the bird will do, right? It can fly away, it can like do a number of unexpected things. It interacts with you. So I don't know what's the measure of like interestingness. I think it can be articulated at least partially. Why you don't go around your room now and just randomly, because you're not getting to some sort of structure that's meaningful for you, I guess, from each of these books, whereas you're getting some kind of meaningful structure, some kind of understanding from, I don't know, doing it in either a lab setting or doing it in a conversational setting, or I don't know.
Yeah, but this creation of an intelligent, or let's leave this aside, just creation of a human being, it's such a age-old idea, an age-old aspiration of this capacity to create something that will probably be, I don't even know if we want to create something that would be like us, or something that you don't really know, whether it would be like a bird, like you said. Whether we want to create like living rocks, very predictable but artificial, or whether we want to create birds in the sense that you described, which will be, I created a life form, and I have no idea what.
I mean, I can also answer like in this very Reza Negarestani way that that artificial intelligence is like almost like a step in the history of spirit. Like it's a necessary step. Like
no, we're there again. See?
But just this, that human consciousness, spirit, whatever, is like transforms itself, right? It transforms the very things that like produce it in a way. And so in that way it's like kind of just like a logical continuation of what has already been happening.
So basically that would be in a certain sense like the developmental or evolution of a certain individuation, in the sense of, I'm not talking about like individuals, but the capacity to free yourself from and creatively engage with your conditions of possibility, to the point where you're basically willing to negate yourself so that the new qualitative level would be achieved.
I think that's basically intelligence and spirit. Like,
but what is the motivation behind that?
God, Primoz from the Wittgensteinian perspective.
Because I think this is very important in all these debates, practically and theoretically. What is actually driving us to pursue the specific thesis we are trying to argue for? And what are these theses?
The march of reason.
But yeah, there are several layers you can answer this. So one is just like, why do we do it? And you can then develop like individual theories, and you can develop certain naturalistic theories. But then you have like these grander theories, like the one that Ela now developed, which is like Hegel synthesized with the development of technology, where it is a movement of the spirit itself, Primoz. It aspires towards its own realization and actualization. But one thing that I would have issue with, for example, people like Reza, is still he has this weird idea that somehow with technology, then this will be it. It's always like this next step is it. Just like with Hegel now, with the Prussian state, this will be it. And then it, of course, wasn't it. So this idea of, okay, maybe there is a certain movement, but this just being so cocky that you have this idea that this is the next step that will happen, this will be the it, and we are just now there, that will, it might be that will be a qualitative shift, but then again, why couldn't be then another one? So
it's a involution, a regression.
So backwards.
Well, yeah, a way to avoid the anguish of unpredictability. And
well, yeah, that's a different story, right, Adnan? We have a different story as well, where you're going in the opposite direction, Kali Yuga and all of that, a slow decline. And now we've been talking about this idea that we're kind of, technology will be the next leap, but you have a different account, like a very diametrically opposed account, which says this will be precisely the jump into the next level of degradation. So it's also a certain way of looking at things. We haven't really followed that track, but it's not necessarily a not interesting one.
Just one more thing I would comment on here is that I think what we're touching on here points to the need to approach all these scientific endeavors in a wider framework that takes into account these wider anthropological concerns. This is why I like Plessner so much, because he takes this broad view. Why are we doing all this scientific work in the first place? It's because it's important to understand what is motivating us, because there might be these not necessarily Freudian drives behind us. What is the basic structure that governs us and makes us pursue these things in these specific manners? And I think it has important implications in questions like this, from anthropomorphization to epiphenomenalism and so forth. And so, yeah, this is what I'm always trying to kind of argue for, is taking this more broader perspective even when doing all these more low level mind kind of thing, which I think is something that, for example, in activism seems to have been used to be doing. There's this participatory sense making now and everything, but sometimes I got a feeling that it's very kind of claustrophobic, or at least limited to a certain level of interaction. But then there's this huge gap between the rest of, or this wider frame of human existence, which governs all our pursuits on the lower levels.
Yeah, and this is now because there's no way that any activist will be listening 2 hours and 15 minutes of our rambling. So a good way to articulate this is precisely why I personally would, for example, never identify as an activist or what have you, because me and Michel Bitbol, as you know, Atul, for instance, and some others, we've written a paper, and Evan Thompson was very critical of that paper because he said that we were kind of doing some sort of a hagiography of Varela, because kind of we were saying, you know, it would be nice to go back to the early text, and there's some merit and value to that. And you know, interestingly, I took this to heart, but in a different way that he kind of intended it. His main point was, you know, we shouldn't be really kind of fetishizing Varela. He did a lot, but a lot of things happened since. Agreed. But for me personally, this basically means this is precisely why I see that I myself am not really an activist, because I'm not that interested in the things that happened later on. The reason why I found Varela so interesting was precisely because he was doing what you were saying. Like, he constantly had this ongoing reflection of, how do I fit into this story, and what does it mean for me to be doing what I'm doing? How does it reflect on the concepts that I'm using? You know, my mode of positioning myself to the world and to the questions, what it means. And this is definitely true. In contemporary activism, it basically developed its own distinct terminology, to the point where it almost seems that certain terms are like used as talismans. You know, they're just kind of used to ward off the evil spirits and to show that, you know, we are the good ones, and the good ones recognize the talisman, so we know what we're talking about. I'm not trying to be mean here. They're just trying to develop a certain program. Yeah. But the thing is that this somehow left by wayside a lot of interesting things. And Evan was right in the sense of, I'm not the one to be telling them, well, you know, if you want to be an activist, you really have to go to Varela and do what he was doing. No, you can do whatever you want. But the thing is, I'm not necessarily interested in that, and that's it. You do your own thing, I do my own thing. The truth is, however, that a lot of what made this particular movement so interesting was kind of left to fall by wayside. It is no longer there, or it is just like at the beginning, almost like you know, I tip my hat to the idea, because, you know, you have to in a traditional country, you have to show your respect to the gods. You don't necessarily believe in them, but this is how you were raised, so you do it at the beginning of the paper. You know what I mean? So there's precisely.
I agree with that, because I also had reading all those papers by Varela, which you unearthed for us in the Ouroboros sessions. He had a much broader perspective and a much greater awareness of of his involvement as a self in all these processes, and also these ideas of collective selfhoods. And for example, in the Tree of Knowledge, they're also a lot more ambitious than later in activism. They really try to span the broad picture of life, which I think is necessary, at least as a sketch, to be able to situate everything else that you're doing in a broader framework.
Yeah, plus Primus, you know how it's structured. Like it's structured in a way where it has already this interesting reflective moment at the very beginning, and then they develop a story and bring it back. It's intriguing in many different levels. It's intriguing as a philosophy. It's intriguing as a scientific theory or fragments of it. It's also intriguing in many ways, you know, the implications for the ethics or the mode of life, or what it means for you to position yourself to the world. And yeah, the reason why I find Varela interesting is he was in a certain sense a seeker, and there's no need, one can be interested in Varela and not necessarily, people then kind of think, well, then you're an activist. No, I mean, I'm just interested in him. I can be interested also, for example, in Merleau-Ponty, and I wouldn't say I'm a phenomenologist for that. Yeah, I can explore certain authors, certain points of view, and they can nourish me, they can give me something. Don't necessarily have to then, not because I would be, I don't have an issue with that. I'm not a special Tinkerbell that cannot be categorized and transgresses all the boundaries of the categories. It's not this pose. It's just like genuinely things that have been developing afterwards don't really have that much of an appeal to me. Some of them are interesting, yes, but not to the point where I would say, yeah, this is, this I would like to pursue fully.
This kind of brings us also to Pierre Hadot, where he talks about the ancient schools of philosophy. This tendency is still pretty strong. People are trying to congregate around certain thinkers, certain schools of ideas, and then just gravitate in the same area. Whereas this more Platonic, Socratic spirit of philosophy is really this inquiry in all these different ways, from all these different vantage points. And I really like that also about Varela.
Yeah, I think we've had a really good run today. So maybe we call it an evening, a night. Yeah. Okay. Ella, really nice presentation, especially given the circumstances. So nicely done. Very, very lucid. Thank you for that.
That's good news.
Yeah, thank you, Ella.
It's a pity we didn't get to the epiphenomenalism. There were some really good points there in the last part as well, but maybe there will be time. So be well. See you in 2 weeks.